You ever wonder? The story I sometimes tell at the standard class, the story of the little deer, the part crippled deer. I think I should recount this because it happened when I was 12 years old. That was one of the tests. Granted, in the Apache culture, in Grandfather's clan specifically, when a boy or a girl reaches 11, 12 years old, they are given the honor, a certain select individual, to hunt the meat for the elders for the winter. And the prophecies had been delivered. That year of scrutiny and judgment had passed, and I was now into the year of choice and testing. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal to hunt the elders' meat for the winter. But it is. You're honored. It is a rites of passage. You go from being a boy to a hunter, a warrior. You start on the path of a shaman. But it is the way the meat had to be hunted. Close range, meaning the weapon that you had to use had to be handheld. Rick and I had hunted before. My God, since the first week we met Grandfather, if we wanted to eat in the Pine Barrens, we collected edible plants or we hunted. We used traps. We used throwing sticks. We used atlatls. We used bows and arrows. We hunted everything from mice and fish and frogs up to deer, the largest game we have in the Pine Barrens. I remember that summer. Grandfather chose me to hunt his winter meat. That meat that would be dried and smoked and kept in the shelter to add to stews and whatever meat we could also hunt in the cold grips of winter. I was honored. I was flabbergasted because Rick should have been chosen. After all, he was Grandfather's kin. But Grandfather chose me. Wow. I had heard stories about this rites of passage. The glorification, the power, the honor, and I was ready for it. The first thing I did was to make the killing weapon. My dad had brought me down from the northern part of New Jersey this magnificent piece of flint. We don't have it in the Pine Barrens. My dad used to think it's strange we had to go run parts either into upstate New York or way up in New Jersey that I asked for flint or jasper or something else. My brother had asked for a toy, He brought me back this beautiful piece of flint, and I had fashioned this gorgeous spear point out of it, 9.5 inches. I went out and I found a fire-killed oak, something 1.5 feet long, and I attached that blade to that oak. The whole thing might have been 2 foot, 2.5 foot long, very sturdy, and I presented it to the grandfather. I showed it to him, and he gave me the nod that it was good. I knew then it was time to go out and search for the animal that I was going to kill at close range. I had to follow the way of the wolves, the way of the predators. I didn't want to take a trophy animal. Not only I couldn't, because that deer would have been too big, too powerful, but it would have also been too much meat for grandfather to consume that winter. It would have been a waste. And after all, the wolves, the major predators, do not prey on the trophy animals. Instead, they prey on the very old, the sick, the injured. And the biggest game we had in the Pine Barrens, of course, was deer. And I remember it was late in August, grandfather gave me the nod to search out the deer that would become the winter meat. I found it within hours. It was absolutely perfect. This deer was a yearling. It had been born that spring. And it was diminutive, just big enough to feed grandfather for the winter once the meat was smoked. But there was also another problem. It had a hip deformity. It couldn't run. It could barely walk. And the only reason it survived was we were in the summer months. And vegetation was succulent. I began to track, follow, stalk that deer for weeks. Every available moment, I wanted to know everything about it. I wanted to know where it and its mother slept, where it drank, its feeding routes, its escape routes. I got to know that deer so well. And they got so used to seeing me around, but yet not harming them, that so frequently they'd walk by a trail that they knew that they'd come along. And I'd stand there, and I reached down and touched that little fawn, and it would never jump away. In fact, there was occasions when they bedded down for the day that I'd actually bed down myself. And I could lift my head and look at that little deer and its mother lifting their head, never looking at me, but looking out for danger, and then go back to sleep during the day. And then I'd follow them at night. My God, I knew that deer well. The end of September, grandfather said, "It is time." Oh my God, this was the moment of honor, the rites of passage, moving from childhood and becoming a hunter, a warrior, a man. I knew exactly where I was going to go. There was this old farmer's field that had overgrown. And there was this small pine in the center of that field that had been struck by lightning, hitting the top, forcing the tree to grow stout branches. Wasn't very tall, but perfect. Because the lower, stouter limbs afforded me a place to stand on, which happened to be right above the deer trail that deer and its mother always used. If I had a watch back then, I could have timed the whole scenario to the moment. But no, I was up in that tree because I wanted everything to go right. Hours before, grandfather believed firmly in a clean kill. No suffering. Death instant. And I stood on that limb. I could see that trail beneath me. And my plan was this. When that little deer passed under that limb, I was going to drop, ram that short thrusting spear between his shoulder blades, and cut back and forth, severing his spine and stopping his heart. Instant death. A clean kill. An honorable kill. And I remember seeing that mother deer hitting the edge of that field. And she started to feed along the edge. The little one never followed her. It was too long a walk for him to bear. Instead, he went straight, a path that would bring him under the very limb upon which I stood. And I remember seeing his head pass, his neck. There comes a point in survival where you have to let go of your humanness, where you can no longer think, where there just is action and reaction with no restriction in strength or speed. If thought comes into the picture, there is always thought before action and reaction, and it is wrought with restriction. And I let go of my humanness and I dropped, and I could feel that spear go into that deer. And I went to cut, and my spear broke. There is a thing inside a human that reaches back to our primal path, that which is called the animal within, let loose in times of dire survival situations. And I took that deer's neck in my hands. It was crippled but not dead. And I began pounding its head into the ground, blood splattering all over me. And I watched its eyes go cold and gray. I could feel its spirit slip through my fingers. I awoke from this state, hearing my own growls in my throat. And I looked down at this deer, and I realized I knew this deer better than I knew my own brother. That deer trusted me. And now, in the most horrific act of violence, I killed it. Oh, it was so different. So different than releasing that arrow or throwing that throwing stick or having that trap do the dirty work. You're not at the point of death there. But here, feeling that spirit slip through my hands, boy, I knew what death was. I felt it. I began to cry uncontrollably, shake. At first of all, I grew angry at myself, but then I grew angrier at grandfather. I grew enraged. He had built this up to something that it wasn't. This stinking rites of passage was a lie, was vile. I remember picking up my broken spear and throwing that deer up over my shoulder, so light and frail. Could feel the blood running down my chest from its gaping wound in his back. Covered in sweat, trembling with rage, I walked right to grandfather's camp. My ambition, I was going to throw that deer at him and walk out of the woods forever. I wanted none of it. None of it. No rites of passage. No. I was done. And I remember getting to his camp, and there he sat at the other side of the fire, so serene. No blood on his hands. And as I walked into the clearing, his eyes met mine, and his eyes said to me, "Grandson, I've been there." And before I could speak, he lifted that old gnarled finger at me and said, "Grandson, when you can feel the same way about a blade of grass torn from the earth as you do about that little deer, then and only then will you be one with all things. The problem is, grandson, in your spiritual arrogance, you do not hear the cries of the ants that you crush. You do not feel the pain and the bleeding of the trees. You do not hear the wails of suffering in the mice that are killed by your traps." And I realized he was right. I had built in my mind some spiritual hierarchy, like somehow deer were more important than mice, and mice were more important than ants, and ants were more important than grasses. What grandfather was telling me is that they were all important. They all have spirit. That's the year of testing. That's one of many. One of so many. And it took me months to back off of that incident that caused me to look at hunting and life in a whole different way, to appreciate every spark of life out there. Taught me to realize that every tiny grain of sand has a spirit. I realized it was a test. I could have walked forever from the woods.